On the night a duke came to weigh the woman he was being forced to marry, he did not arrive in a gilded carriage. He came through the servants' gate, mud on his boots, a borrowed coat on his back, a false name on his tongue. He told them he was nobody, a hired man sent ahead to ready the stables for the great lord's visit. And for one night, in a cold house full of secrets, the most powerful man in 3 counties stood in the dark and listened. What he heard through a kitchen wall would end one woman's future and begin another's. But the cruelest part? The bride he had come to marry had no idea the servant carrying her trunks up the stairs was the very man whose name she was already practicing signing. Stay with me. Because everything you think you know about who deserves a happy ending, this story is about to turn it upside down. The winter of 1818 came to Hartley Grange like a debt collector. It crept under the warped doors. It frosted the inside of the windows. It thinned the smoke from the chimneys until the great old house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether it would survive until spring. Hartley had once been grand. Now it was a house of almosts, almost warm, almost respectable, almost saved. And the only person who knew exactly how close it was to the edge was a young woman named Eleanor Vane. She was 23, the elder daughter, the practical one, the one who knew which floorboards groaned, which servants hadn't been paid in 2 months, and exactly how many candles were left in the house, 11. She was the one who rose before the maids to light the kitchen fire herself, because they could no longer afford to keep enough of them. Her younger sister Cordelia never rose before noon, and here is the difference between the 2 Vane sisters. Remember it because the whole story turns on it. Cordelia was the kind of beautiful that made rooms go quiet, golden hair, a laugh like falling coins, a face that had been told every single day of her life that it was the family's one remaining fortune. Eleanor was the kind of person you didn't notice until something went wrong, and then somehow she was always the one fixing it. Cordelia wore silk. Eleanor wore her late mother's altered gowns, the gray ones, the lavender ones. Cordelia called them ghost colors. Eleanor called them what they were, practical. But there was something Eleanor didn't know that cold morning, as she knelt to coax a flame from damp kindling, something already traveling toward Hartley on a black horse, something that would look at her exactly twice, and change the course of her entire life. The letter arrived on a silver tray that hadn't been polished in a year. Sir Hugh Vane broke the seal at the breakfast table with shaking hands, and as he read, the color drained from his face and then rushed back into it. A flush of something his daughters hadn't seen in years. Hope. Terrifying, dangerous hope. "It's him," he whispered. "It's actually him." "Who, father?" Cordelia set down her cup. Sir Hugh looked up, and his voice cracked on the name. "The Duke of Ravenscar." The room changed temperature, because everyone knew that name. Julian Thorne, the 8th Duke of Ravenscar. Impossibly rich, impossibly cold. A man so reclusive that half of society wasn't sure he existed at all, and the other half whispered that he was either a genius or a monster. His man of business, Sir Hugh read, his hands trembling, proposes to settle the whole of the Vane debts, every penny, in exchange, he swallowed, in exchange for a marriage to my daughter. Silence. And then Cordelia laughed, a soft, delighted, utterly certain sound. "Well," she said, smoothing her skirts, "of course he does." She didn't even look at her sister. It never occurred to her, not for a single heartbeat, that the offer could be meant for anyone but herself. "The Duchess of Ravenscar." She tried the words on like a new gown. "It does have a certain music to it, doesn't it?" And Eleanor, quiet Eleanor, standing by the sideboard where she always stood, felt a cold, strange calm settle over her. Of course it was for Cordelia. It was always for Cordelia. The world was built for girls like Cordelia. Eleanor had simply learned, a long time ago, to be the furniture in her own family's story. What none of them knew, what not one soul at that breakfast table could have guessed, was that the letter contained one small, precise detail that nobody had read carefully enough. The contract did not say Cordelia Vane. It said only Miss Vane. And Sir Hugh had 2 daughters. Hold on to that. The Duke certainly would. 200 miles away, in a cold solicitor's office in London, Julian Thorne stared out a rain-streaked window and felt the walls of his life closing in. He did not want a wife. He wanted his estate to survive. His father, the seventh Duke, had been a man of grand appetites and ruinous judgment, and when he died, Julian had inherited everything: the title, the lands, the ancient name, and the rot underneath all of it. For 5 years, Julian had fought a silent, brutal war to hold it together. He'd sold paintings. He'd closed wings of the house. He'd worked like a clerk by candlelight, while society called him cold, miserly, strange. He didn't care what they called him. 3,000 tenants depended on the Ravenscar estate. 3,000 families would lose everything if he failed. This marriage was the last gamble. A bankrupt baronet with a marriageable daughter and a dowry locked in trust. A clean transaction. And Julian despised it. In his mind, he had already built the girl. She would be grasping, vain. A scheming little country miss with a coronet in her eyes, shoved forward by a desperate father. "They'll be expecting you Friday, Your Grace," his solicitor said. "The carriage is arranged." "Cancel it." The solicitor blinked. "Your Grace." Julian turned from the window, and his gray eyes were hard as flint. "I'll go alone, on horseback. I'll arrive Thursday, a day early, and I will not be announced." "Your Grace, that is highly irregular." "I am about to sell my name and my future to strangers," Julian said quietly. "I will not do it blind. I want to see this family as they truly are, not as they'll perform for a duke." He pulled on his gloves. "I want to see what manner of trap I'm walking into." He thought he was going to Hartley to unmask a schemer, and he was right. There was a schemer waiting for him. But what he didn't expect, what he could never have planned for, was that the same night would put a second woman in front of him, one the family had hidden in plain sight. And by the time the sun rose, the cold Duke of Ravenscar would not be the same man at all. It was raining when he reached Hartley on Thursday evening. Not a grand carriage on the gravel drive, just a lone rider on a powerful black horse, in a plain dark coat splattered with mud, looking for all the world like a groom seeking a night's shelter. He did not go to the front door. He led his horse around to the stable yard, into the smell of wet straw and wood smoke, and there a thin boy came running to take the reins. "You here for the Duke's visit, sir?" Julian let one corner of his mouth move. "Sir?" The boy had no idea. "Sent ahead," he said, "to see the horses are ready for his Grace tomorrow. They told me there'd be a bed for me." "In the loft, sir, over the tack room." "That'll do." And just like that, the Duke of Ravenscar became Jack, a nameless hired man, invisible the way all servants are invisible. He could go anywhere. He could hear anything. He told himself he'd watch for an hour and ride to the inn. He was wrong about that, too, because the first voice he heard clearly, carrying out of a lit window into the cold dark, belonged to a young woman, and what she was saying would freeze him to the spot. The kitchen window glowed gold in the rain. Julian, crossing the yard toward the loft, slowed without meaning to. The window was cracked open against the heat of the stove, and two voices spilled out into the night. He should have walked on. He didn't. "It is unbearable," the first voice was saying, bright, petulant, pretty. "He should have come today. I have held myself in a state of perfect radiance since dawn, and for what? To be kept waiting in this tomb of a house?" Julian stilled in the shadow of the wall. "And this gown," a rustle of silk. 3 seasons old, he'll think us paupers, Eleanor." A second voice answered, lower, calm, with no self-pity in it at all. "We are paupers, Cordelia. So, Cordelia, the beauty, and Eleanor, the quiet one. We won't be for long." Cordelia's voice turned warm with greed. "Once I am Duchess, I shall have everything. A house in town, a box at the opera. I shall burn every gray rag in this house and never wear lavender again as long as I live. You should be happy for me, Lou." Petulant again. "You've no idea the sacrifice I'm making, chaining myself to some dreary old recluse I've never even met. They say he's as cold as a corpse and twice as dull, probably ancient, probably hideous." Julian's jaw tightened. "Good," he told himself. "Exactly what I expected. Vapid, grasping. He should ride to London tonight and let the whole rotten arrangement burn." Then Cordelia's voice dropped, sweet, conspiratorial, poisonous. "But I'll tell you a secret, Lou." A soft, cruel little laugh. "Once I'm settled, and the Duke has served his purpose, there is always Charles, Lord Whitmore. He's always adored me, and he's far more handsome than any musty old duke. A duchess is allowed her little secrets, isn't she?" In the dark, Julian Thorne went very, very still. He was not just being offered a wife. He was being offered a future betrayal. And the woman selling it to him was laughing. He'd heard enough, more than enough. He turned to go, and then the quiet sister spoke, and what she said stopped him cold a second time, because it was the last thing he expected to hear in a house like this. "You shouldn't say such things," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't a sermon. It was simply tired, the weariness of someone who'd said it many times before, to no effect. "You're building a house on sand, Cordelia. Oh, here we go. A title isn't a home. A fortune isn't a home." Eleanor's voice didn't rise, but it carried. Kindness is a home. Honesty is a home. And those are the two things in all the world you can't buy with a duke's money. Cordelia laughed, that brittle, mocking sound. "And that," she said sweetly, "is precisely why you're the one in gray, and I'm the one who'll be a duchess. Kindness doesn't pay the butcher, darling. Honesty won't buy a single gown." A rustle as she rose. "You're a fool, Lou, a sweet, useless fool. Now, I'm cold, and my hair will frizz. Come up and help me dress. You're so good at being needed." A door closed, and outside, in the freezing dark, the Duke of Ravenscar did not move. Through the window, he could see her now. Eleanor, alone, at the long, scrubbed kitchen table. She didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears were exactly what her sister wanted. She simply sat. Then she reached out and gently straightened a single wilting flower in a cracked jug on the table. A small, instinctive act of care for something nobody else had even noticed. And something inside Julian Thorne shifted. He had come to Hartley expecting to find a schemer. He had found one. But he had also found something he had not factored into a single one of his cold calculations. He had found the woman her own sister had just called useless. The one who spoke of kindness while wearing the colors of survival. The one who carried an entire family's cruelty on her shoulders with more dignity than any coronet could buy. And in his mind, he saw the contract again. The single, careless line. A marriage to Miss Vane. It did not say which Miss Vane. Sir Hugh Vane had 2 daughters, and the Duke of Ravenscar, a man who never, ever changed his mind once it was made, had just made a new and very dangerous decision. He simply needed one more day among the servants to be certain, and that one day would bring him closer to Eleanor than any duke had any right to get. He did not ride to the inn. The next morning, Jack, the hired man, was up before the sun, and he made himself useful in the stable yard. And then, when the household woke into chaos over the great visitor expected at noon, he made himself useful in the house. And this is the part Cordelia never saw. Because Cordelia never looked at servants, but Eleanor did. She found the new man hauling water for the kitchen that no one had asked him to haul. "You don't have to do that," she said. "You were hired for the horses." He straightened. Up close, his eyes were a startling gray. "Hands are hands, miss. There's work. I do it." She studied him a moment. The plain coat, the educated voice that didn't quite match it. And then she did something that undid him completely. She handed him bread and cheese wrapped in a cloth. "You've been working since before light. You haven't eaten." She said it plainly, as though it were obvious, as though a hired stranger's hunger mattered as much as anyone's. Julian Thorne, who had not been fed by another human being's kindness since he was a child, stood holding warm bread in a cold kitchen and felt something crack open in his chest. "Thank you," he said. And he meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. They worked in silence for a while, scrubbing the long table side by side. Then Jack, testing her, the way a man tests a coin to see if it rings true, said the cruel thing on purpose. "They say the Duke who's coming is a hard man, miss. Cold. Buys himself a wife the way he'd buy a horse." He kept his eyes on the wood. "Your sister's welcome to him." He expected her to agree, to laugh, or to flinch. Eleanor set down her cloth. "I think," she said slowly, "that a man doesn't sell his own name unless something he loves is drowning." Julian's hands went still. "People call him cold," she went on, not looking up. "But cold men don't fight to save anything. They simply let it sink and walk away. Whatever that man is, he's not cold. He's cornered, and there's a great deal of difference between the two, though I doubt anyone's ever bothered to tell him so. For a long moment the Duke of Ravenscar could not speak. In 5 years, no one, not his solicitor, not his peers, not a single soul in all of England, had looked past the word cold to the truth underneath it. And here was a woman in a gray dress who thought she was talking to a stable hand, who had no reason in the world to be generous to the man buying her sister. And she had seen straight through him in a single sentence. All that long, strange morning. They worked the same rooms, the disguised duke and the overlooked daughter, and she had no idea that every gentle, unguarded thing she did was being weighed by the one man whose verdict would decide her entire future. It happened just before 11. A maid dropped a tray on the main stair. The good china, the last of the unbroken set, shattering across the marble. Cordelia came down in a fury, in a cloud of pink silk, and she did not see a frightened girl on her knees among the broken pieces. She saw an obstacle to her wedding. "You stupid, clumsy creature!" Her hand drew back to strike. "Cordelia!" Eleanor was there. She'd crossed the hall in an instant and put herself between her sister and the maid, and she did not flinch. "It was an accident? She's terrified. Leave her be. It is his Grace's visit, and this animal. Then I'll take the blame," Eleanor said evenly. "Tell father it was me. Now, help me clear this before someone is cut." And she knelt, in her gray gown, and began gathering the broken china with her bare hands, gently telling the shaking maid it was all right. It was all right. No one would be punished. From the shadow of the upper landing, a hired man in a plain coat watched a woman shield someone who could do nothing for her, take a punishment that wasn't hers, and ask for nothing in return. And the Duke of Ravenscar made his decision final. But someone else had been watching the landing too. Cordelia had come to the top of the stairs in time to see it all. The hired man emerging from the shadows to help her sister gather the broken china, to see his hand brush Eleanor's, to see Eleanor look up at a common stable hand and smile, softer and freer than Cordelia had ever once seen her smile inside this house. And in Cordelia's beautiful, calculating mind, a plan clicked into place like a key in a lock. She did not see a kindness. She saw a weapon, because Cordelia had begun to sense, somewhere underneath all her certainty, that the Duke's gaze hadn't lingered on her at all the way a bridegroom should. And a clever woman eliminates a rival before the man even knows there is one. She went to find her mother, and she was smiling. By the time the Duke arrived, she had decided exactly how she would destroy her sister, and she had no idea she was about to hand the knife to the one man who would turn it back on her. The morning of the visit, Cordelia was a portrait of devoted concern. She drew her father aside in the cold parlor and lowered her voice to a tremble. "Papa, it grieves me to say it, but His Grace deserves the truth before he ties his name to this family." A delicate, practiced pause. "It is Eleanor. I saw her this very morning, in the arms of one of the hired men, a stable hand, Papa, laughing with him, touching him." Her eyes filled right on cue. If word of such a thing reached the Duke after the wedding, the scandal would ruin us all. It must be me he chooses, for the family's sake, for yours. Sir Hugh, drowning man that he was, grasped the rope she offered without once asking whether it was real. "You're certain? I saw it with my own eyes." And so the trap was set, not in a dark garden, but in broad daylight, baited with the truth, twisted just far enough to kill. Eleanor had no idea. She was downstairs, pinning up a fallen curl, bracing herself to stand at the back of the hall and be invisible one more time, never dreaming that her own sister had spent the morning building a fire beneath her, and was only waiting for the most powerful man in England to walk through the door so she could light it in front of him. At precisely noon, a carriage came up the drive. The family assembled in the hall in a fever of nerves. Sir Hugh sweating, Cordelia arranged like a portrait, Eleanor pressed quietly into the back, half hidden as always. The doors opened, and the Duke of Ravenscar stepped inside, tall, severe, dressed now in dark, perfect wool, every inch the most powerful man any of them had ever stood before. Cordelia sank into a flawless curtsy, her smile radiant, already rehearsed. But she did not wait for pleasantries. She had a fire to light, and she meant to light it before the Duke could look too long at anyone but her. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying, trembling with manufactured sorrow. "Before you honor this family, my conscience demands I tell you something. It pains me beyond words." She turned and pointed, actually pointed, at her sister in the back of the hall. "That woman is Eleanor, my sister. And not 3 hours ago, I saw her with my own eyes in the embrace of a common stable hand, laughing, touching him." Her chin lifted in triumph. "I could not let you bind your noble name to such a household, without knowing what kind of woman lives beneath this roof." The hall went deathly silent. Sir Hugh closed his eyes. Eleanor's face flooded scarlet, then white. She opened her mouth, and found she had no defense, because the bones of it were true. She had been with a hired man that morning. She had smiled at him. There was no version of the truth she could speak that would not sound like guilt. She was ruined. In a single sentence, in front of the most powerful man in England, her sister had ended her. Cordelia watched it land and allowed herself the smallest, sweetest smile of victory. And that smile is the last truly happy moment Cordelia Vane would ever have, because she had just described, in front of a room full of witnesses, exactly what the Duke of Ravenscar had done that very morning, and she had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. The Duke did not look at Cordelia. His gray eyes moved across the room, over the sweating father, over the dazzling daughter already certain she had won, and stopped on the woman at the back, on Eleanor, who looked at his face, and went white for an entirely different reason. Because she knew that face. She had fed that face bread and cheese that very morning. She had defended that face. She had told that face that its owner wasn't cold, only cornered. The Duke crossed the hall, past Cordelia's outstretched triumph, past Sir Hugh's stammering. He stopped in front of Eleanor. "Miss Vane," he said. Your Grace." Cordelia stepped forward, sensing too late that something had gone terribly wrong. "Not you." His voice was quiet steel. He did not look away from Eleanor. "This Miss Vane." The hall went utterly silent. "Your sister speaks the truth about one thing," the Duke said, and now he turned slowly to face the whole frozen room. "This woman was in the company of a hired man this morning. She fed him when he was hungry. She worked beside him. She shielded a servant from a blow that wasn't hers to take." A pause that hung in the air like a blade. "I know all of this, because I was the hired man." Nobody breathed. "I arrived a day early. I came through your stable gate. I slept in your loft, and I carried your trunks, and not one of you looked at my face." His eyes swept the room. "Except her." Cordelia's smile had died. Your Grace, that's not... I also stood beneath your kitchen window last night, Miss Cordelia Vane." His gray eyes turned to her, and they were lethal. "I heard every word. About the gowns you'd burn. About the dreary, hideous old Duke you'd never met." A terrible pause. "About Lord Whitmore. About a duchess's little secrets." The color drained from Cordelia's face like water from a cracked jug. She had built a trap to destroy her sister with the truth, and the trap had closed on her own throat. She swayed. She looked in that moment exactly like the maid she had nearly struck on the stairs. But the Duke wasn't finished, because there was still one person in that hall who didn't understand what was happening, and she was the only one who mattered. He turned back to Eleanor. "This morning," he said, and his voice changed, the steel falling away to something raw. "You fed a hungry stranger you owed nothing. You took a blow that was meant for a frightened girl. You spoke of honesty and kindness as though they were worth something, in a house that has spent your whole life teaching you that they are not." Eleanor's eyes were swimming. "Your Grace, I don't understand." "The contract name's Miss Vane," he said. "It does not say which, and I will be married within the month. That has not changed." He took a breath. "But I will be damned if it's to the one who was expecting me." He held out his hand. A duke's hand, ungloved, palm open. The whole world seemed to stop. "I have spent 5 years," Julian said, low, only for her now, "being called cold by every soul who ever met me. 5 years, and not one of them ever looked past the word." His voice nearly broke. "And then this morning, a woman in a gray dress, who thought she was speaking to a stable hand, who had no reason on earth to be kind to me, told me I wasn't cold at all, only cornered." He paused. "No one has ever seen me, not once, until you." He turned his open hand a fraction closer to hers. You said a name is not a home. That kindness is a home, a breath. I have a great many names, Miss Vane, and not one of them has ever felt like one. I should like to find out if you're right, with you. Slowly, disbelieving, Eleanor lifted her chin. She looked at her father, frozen, at her sister, defeated, at the man in front of her who had been Jack this morning and was the Duke of Ravenscar now, and was, impossibly, looking at her, choosing her, the furniture, the afterthought, the girl in gray. She put her small, work-roughened hand into his. Then we shall find out together, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Your Grace. Julian, he said. And the world tilted on its axis. The autumn light came golden through the tall windows of Ravenscar's library, a room that had stopped breathing for 30 years and was now, somehow, the warmest in the house. The books were dusted, the curtains were thrown open. There were flowers on the hall tables, and the smell of beeswax where there had only been cold. Eleanor had not become a decoration. She had become a force. She'd learned every servant's name, opened every closed wing, and, with the same practical mind that once counted candles at Hartley, found a forgotten flaw in the estate accounts that saved the failing northern mine, and with it, 3,000 families. The tenants called her a miracle. Julian called her his clever, impossible duchess. He had learned to smile. It still surprised him every time. As for Hartley, the debts were paid, every penny just as promised. Sir Hugh and his wife lived quietly now in a small house by the sea, and Cordelia married a wealthy man twice her age, with a temper and a tight grip on his purse. Once, that winter, the two sisters passed on a London street. Cordelia was wrapped in furs, dripping with the jewels she'd always dreamed of, and she stopped dead when she saw Eleanor, whole and warm and happy, on the arm of the Duke who had once carried her trunks. For one moment, something flickered across Cordelia's beautiful face. Not anger, something far worse. The understanding that she had held kindness in her own house for 20 years, called it useless, and let it walk out the door into someone else's arms. She turned away first. She did not say a word, and Eleanor, who had every right to gloat and did not, only watched her sister go and felt, to her own surprise, a quiet, aching pity for the girl who had been taught her face was her only worth and had just learned, far too late, how badly she'd been lied to. That afternoon, Julian crossed the library and knelt by Eleanor's chair, resting his head against her knee like a man who had finally come home. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "A girl in a gray dress," she said softly, tracing the line of his jaw. "Alone in a cold kitchen, straightening a dying flower no one else could see." "I think about her all the time," he said. "I think about how lucky the man was who found her." "He wasn't lucky," Eleanor smiled down at him. "He was paying attention. So, here is the thing I want you to take with you tonight. The Duke of Ravenscar had every advantage in the world, wealth, power, the pick of any beauty in the kingdom. But the one thing that saved him, the one thing that led him to the right door, was that he chose to look at the person nobody else thought was worth looking at. And the woman who won everything, she didn't win it by being the loudest, or the prettiest, or the most certain. She won it by being kind when no one important was watching, by being honest when honesty cost her, by giving bread to a stranger she thought could never repay her. Because here is what the cruel sister never understood, and what the world so often gets wrong. Your character is not what you do when the powerful are watching. It is what you do when you believe no one is. So, be the person who is kind in the cold kitchen. Be the one who straightens the dying flower. Be honest when it would be easier to lie, and gentle when no one would notice if you weren't. Because you never, ever know who is standing in the dark, paying attention. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If Eleanor's quiet strength touched something in you, if you've ever felt like the one in gray, the one nobody chose, tell me in the comments. Tell me which city you're watching from and what this story made you feel. I read every single one, and if you believe kindness deserves a happy ending, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next story finds you. Your next one is already waiting.